Now I'm excited to introduce our host, Dr. Kelly Tzoumis. So before coming to DePaul almost 20 years ago, Professor Kelly Tzoumis worked at the U.S. Department of Energy at two national laboratories in Washington, D.C. She has worked at several Superfund sites as a program manager, as well as an external liaison to communities working on remediation. She has also served as a Congressional Fellow for former Senator Simon on Capitol Hill and was Distinguished Chair for Fulbright in Environmental Studies. She has been an invited lecturer worldwide on environmental policy and management issues that have included China, Italy, Spain, and Greece. She is a leader in global online learning, working with 8 university partners on 4 continents for DePaul. Her recent book titled Toxic Chemicals in America, Controversies in Humans and Environmental Health was published in 2021. She has many publications and teams with students to attend conferences and has them join her in publishing. Currently, she is working on a book with the Navajo Nation on nuclear waste and its legacy. She has numerous teaching and advising awards from several universities where she taught. Her innovative teaching includes global game simulations, virtual reality lectures, and international policy debates on controversial issues regarding the environment and human health. Her courses include energy policy and politics, national parks governance, sustainable land revitalization and brownfields development, Great Lakes management, environmental justice, nuclear waste disposal, environmental ethics, wetlands policy, statistics, and research methods. She has taught many courses about the Great Lakes on research vessels docked at Navy Pier and taken many student groups to the national parks for a domestic study abroad. She is also leading a large funded effort by DePaul to recruit students with disabilities to DePaul and is working on disability as a DEI issue at DePaul for students and employees. She is a strong proponent of universal design and accessibility for students. She is in development of a new certificate in disability justice, rights, and policy for DePaul students. She is a native of Chicago and from the Chicago Public Schools. In her spare time is spent learning the dyeing culture of the Navajos and paper quilling. She has spent almost 20 years as an accreditor for the Higher Learning Commission and a reviewer for several journals. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Tzoumis.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was a very nice introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to share my screen now. And it's a pleasure to be here on actually Earth Day. And so we're going to go over the Chicago environmental challenges. And then I'm going to then at the end of the presentation focus on nuclear energy and nuclear waste, because that is a very large regional issue and state issue for us that most people don't know Illinois' role or Chicago's role. So thank you for having me. A little bit about Earth Day before we begin, because I want to acknowledge Earth Day. It's April 22nd, of course, today. And the founder of Earth Day was actually Gaylord Nelson, who was a US Senator for Wisconsin and then governor for Wisconsin. And so he's pictured here with Bill Riley, a former head of EPA. And Earth Day really came about, as well as the creation of EPA, 3 major events that occurred in the media. Now, this was before we had a 24-hour news cycle. So these events really were portrayed in on television, but also in newspapers, and the people really galvanized to seeing these things and creating an EPA and an Earth Day. The first thing that really galvanized people was the Cuyahoga River. The Cuyahoga River is in Ohio, and it actually caught on fire several times. And so in years leading up to Earth Day and the creation of EPA, the public was very concerned about seeing these pictures in the media on a river on fire. The next issue that's also attributed to helping us create Earth Day and EPA is the death of Lake Erie. Now, of course, Lake Erie did not die, but because of the amount of phosphorus coming from detergents that were loaded into Lake Erie, and remember, Lake Erie is also the shallowest lake, so it's traumatically impacted by what gets put into Lake Erie, that we started to have zones where fish and other aquatic species could not live because the lake was eutrophizing. And that means the phosphorus was helping grow plant life that was suffocating some of the oxygen levels. So Lake Erie did not die officially. In fact, we've quote unquote resuscitated it, and it is an active fisherman's and productive lake today. But it did get portrayed in the media as dying because of this eutrophication from phosphorus. We now limit phosphorus in the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie. The third thing that I think really is cited in the literature and is really truly an impact in Earth Day creation is Silent Spring. And Silent Spring's author is Rachel Carson. We view Rachel Carson as one of the early environmentalists. She was at the Fish and Wildlife Service, formerly the Bureau of Biological Services, but she wrote a book, and it was an observational book. Even though she was an ecologist, she wrote an observational book about what was happening to the shells of bird eggs and their beaks from the use of pesticides, primarily DDT. And so this book, as well as her additional research on pesticides and herbicides that are used in our environment, all actually helped us get to Earth Day and to creation of EPA. EPA gets created in 1970. It was purposely not put in the cabinet and is a quasi-independent regulatory agency so that it could be independent from different presidential actions. You can see here former President Nixon actually establishes EPA in 1970 and appoints Bill Ruckelshaus, who is, of course, more famous for him being the Attorney General, but it is Bill Ruckelshaus who is the first EPA administrator. So happy Earth Day, everyone. Now, let's do a little background about Chicago and the wonderful history we have of big solutions. We are often called the city of big solutions because in our environmental area, civil engineering, we've done several things to really help the environment. But I do want to point out, and this is a theme that I'm going to conclude with, is sometimes those interventions might solve a immediate problem and then create a legacy of a future problem that we have to contend with. And so I'm going to talk about first the benefits of what we did historically, and then we're going to talk about the legacy of implications of these civil engineering projects. The first one I think that is just amazing is the rise of our street level. You know, we're a wetland, we're a muddy area. Naturally. And so we've drained that area, but at first we had quite a problem in typhoid and cholera because our streets were basically in mud and waterborne mud. So in 1855, without the help of, modern technology, and hydraulics, we actually raised the street level from 4 to 14 feet. And so we actually, you can see here in the right hand pictograph from the Historical Society in Chicago, how we did that. And so that helped with cholera levels, but not enough. So we were actually dumping all of our sewage and all of our waste into the Chicago River. And of course, the Chicago River at that time flowed into the lake, and then we drank the lake water. So Ellis Chesborough, who is a fascinating figure in history for Chicago, as a civil engineer for the city, actually created cribs. And so by 1865, we started to build these cribs. And you could see in the right-hand picture here, water intake cribs, so that we moved the intake of the water farther out from the shore so that we were not necessarily drinking all of our contaminated water that we contaminated and then pumped in. And you can see the old crib there. We at first built 8, and then it went down to 6. We got rid of 2. And now we only have 2 to 3 that are still operational with new cribs you can see attached, the new modern technology. But these cribs are a great simple way to help avoid some of the problems with cholera and typhoid that we were experiencing. However, this also wasn't enough. And so the other thing that we did, which was just amazing, was we reversed the Chicago River. And this helped us tremendously with bacterial and viral outbreaks, particularly from cholera. And so I don't know how much you know about this, but Chicago, particularly around the Oak Park area, you can see this dotted line in the bottom of my screen on this map, is actually, this region is actually in 2 watersheds. And so if you were a drop of water, and this is around Oak Park, and it's very mild of an elevation compared to what you see in continental divides out west. So this is not easily seen. And so if you were a drop of water falling on the west side of the continental divide, you would flow down the Mississippi River into the Mississippi Basin into the Gulf. However, if you were a drop of water on the east side of this area, you would flow into the Great Lakes Basin. So what we did, which was an engineering marvel at the time, is we reversed this river. And so we did that by cutting a canal that ran right up to the Chicago opening for Lake Michigan and down all the way down so that the water would reverse its flow. And this worked. And I've been fortunate to see in the Water Reclamation District of Chicago, the lithographs of the people digging this canal, primarily immigrants, and they had suffered quite a bit of illness doing this. And when we opened up this canal and reversed the Chicago River, it actually flowed backwards. So now we no longer were drinking water that we were polluting because the river no longer went into Lake Michigan. Okay, and I have a nice political cartoon here from the day. St. Louis was not very happy about this. They were having a World's Fair in 1900 and saw a spike, of course, in cholera because we were transferring it downstream. And you can see here, this is Chicago dumping its water. It's a political cartoon onto St. Louis. And St. Louis actually did reach out to the Supreme Court to try to stop this. However, the Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case and said it was moot because the river had already reversed. And so I want to just call your attention. As I said, one of the themes that I'm seeing in our history is where we create a solution at one point can create a legacy of a problem later. Take a look at this map. I'm going to talk about the electrode areas that are located right here that have to be installed because of the problems we have with the reversal of the Chicago River. All right, so current day, what is taking place as our challenges? I want to talk about 4 areas. The first 2 are related, of course. One is, of course, our challenge is in the Chicago area is to protect the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan is really an important resource for the economy as well as for our public health and drinking water. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about air pollution. We do have a problem with our air quality in terms of ozone and particulate matter, but specifically in ozone. And I'm going to show you some information about that here shortly. And then I'm going to conclude on nuclear energy and nuclear waste, something that many of us who live here, and I've grown up here in Chicago and was born and raised and did not realize until I went to work for the U.S. Department of Energy what was taking place in the state of Illinois and in the region of Chicago. So let's first talk, though, about the Great Lakes. What makes Chicago great, of course, is our Great Lakes. They're beautiful. Lake Michigan is a source of transport to the Mississippi River and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Diverse, beautiful architecture that is world-renowned, beautiful parks, thanks to Burnham and his plan in 1909 to keep the lakefront recreational and public, and of course our rich culture in festivals that are usually around the lake in our neighborhoods, and sports and music, and of course we're home to a president. But the Great Lakes are really important in terms of economics for the US. This is pre-COVID numbers because we have not fully returned to our commerce, but pre-COVID numbers show that more than 1.3 million jobs come from the Great Lakes, and that $82 billion in wages are directly tied to the Great Lakes. So they're an engine, an economic engine and a recreational engine that we have to maintain. We also are concerned about our drinking water. And so the Great Lakes have several areas that have been historically contaminated that we've been cleaning up for decades. These are called the areas of concern. If you know anything about Superfund on land, this is quote unquote, the equivalent of Superfund around the Great Lakes. These are our most contaminated areas around the Great Lakes. This is a 2022 map from EPA, so it's current. And we originally started with 43 areas of concern, and you can see them pictured here. 26 of those areas of concern were on the US border. We share that with Canada, and we've been investing through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for decades in cleaning these up, and we've been making progress. So pollution and remediation is ongoing around the Great Lakes. We've also had a problem with invasive species, which I'm going to talk about, particularly when we reversed that Chicago River. It created an expressway for one of our exotic species that have shown up. And of course, we've experienced with the Great Lakes flooding and evaporation. Anyone who's lived here for a period of time knows that at times we've had erosion from excessive levels of the Great Lakes. And in fact, 2019 was one of the higher levels. We saw actually Lake Michigan in July of 2019 being 3 feet higher than usual. And 2019 was one of the extreme years for lake levels height. And we see also evaporation taking place. So we see low levels that have also plagued us in the Great Lakes. These cycles generally are roughly around 12 to 13 years with 6 years of high, 6 years of low. We are starting a lower level. There is an exception with Lake Ontario, which is still remaining high. But this flooding and evaporation, we think, is going to be exacerbated by climate change. We've also had the problem of sewage overflows. And as we raised the streets in Chicago, one of the legacies is that we put in combined sewer output. And so these pipes actually collect both floodwater and sewage water and combine them. And so these combined sewer outflows have been a problem, but we've also got a technology that has been installed, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. And also diversion. Besides pollution, we also have to be concerned about diversion. Diversion is an important part. Chicago has a history of over extracting water, and there are several court cases that we have with states as well as with Canada. And now diverting the water is very carefully monitored. The locks at Chicago are a diversion product. And so we are very careful in making sure that no state or no city diverts too much of its water. And of course, we are watching the lakes very carefully for climate change concerns. Now, I want to talk about some of the exotic species that have plagued us. The sea lamprey was an early one. The sea lamprey actually is an old species. We think it's over 500 million years old. It was actually first found in Lake Erie in 1921, and it is a parasite. And it is a parasite, we think, that has entered because of the different locks and shipping channels. And this parasitic fish has no jaw. And so what has happened is you can see that this parasitic fish actually attaches to the fishes in the Great Lakes, and they don't kill it by the attachment. What happens is when this parasite detaches, it leaves these large wounds in the fish, and the fish dies of infection. And so the sea lamprey we have managed as an exotic species. It is not native to the Great Lakes. It entered the Great Lakes, and so we do have developed lampricides that have actually decreased its population. One of the current exotic species that we have came in through ships, through the ballast water, through our transportation. And we think it came from Eastern Europe. And we first saw it in Lake St. Clair in 1988. And it is a freshwater mussel. This is the zebra or quagga mussels. And you can see a picture of them at the bottom of this screen. And you can see their invasion. This is as of 2021. So this is pretty recent data in how they have invaded. Interesting enough, they're not hermaphrodites, they are sexual, and they reproduce at rapid rates. And the problem, there's a couple problems with these mussels. First, they attach to everything. This is a shopping cart covered with mussels. So they clog our pipes, they bother our shipping. And so this is a real problem. And we had problems underneath Lakeshore Drive where the zebra mussel was clogging up the pipes. They are easily killed with chlorine, but chlorine, as you know, is a very strong chemical, so we have to be careful with our drinking water. But the other thing that they do is these zebra mussels are filter feeders. So they filter out the nutrients, so it hurts the food web in the aquatic system for the Great Lakes. And they clog up, this is an exoskeleton mollusk, so they clog up the digestive system of fish. So these mussels have been very controversial and problematic for us, and they grow easily and they reproduce very fast. Now, remember I just showed you one of the consequences of the reversal of the Chicago River is we created an expressway. And that expressway is for any fish that was strong enough to actually go upstream because the river was reversed. And we do have an Asian carp that has managed to come upstream with the reversal of the Chicago River. This carp is very interesting. It is from Asia, but it was purposely brought over and harvested and was in a fish harvest in Arkansas. And then when a flood occurred, it made its way into the Mississippi and moved up into our region. So the Army Corps of Engineers for many years now has built electric barriers. So this is an amazing innovation. And there's 2 electric barriers where we zap the fish and try to turn that fish around. The Asian carp is a large fish, and it is a fish that eats everything in the food chain. It's a ferocious eater. So we're concerned about it really clearing out the ecosystem in the lakes, and we don't want this fish to get to the lakes. We have seen some signs of this fish getting very close to Lake Michigan, both with mRNAs, and we think that it did not necessarily cross the barrier, but may have been fish that have been released by residents. But we are very concerned about this fish, and you can see the picture here on the right of this fish. It has a unique tendency to jump, and so both with the electrodes or without the electrodes, this fish jumps. And actually there's been injuries because it's a massive fish for it hurting fishermen on their boats. And so you can see this fish jumping here. Now, the other thing that we did, which was a major technology feat, is when we talked about the combined sewer outflows, we combined our floodwaters and sewer waters together. And so because of that, we had to deal with this issue now as a growing metropolis. And so years ago, we started in 1975 TARP, and this is the Deep Tunnel Project. And so what this did is helped with the flooding that we experienced in the inner city in the 1980s, as well as the sewer problems because of the combined waters. We have built a series of deep tunnels underneath the Chicago area and headed out towards O'Hare and the suburban regions to collect the water from rainwater and store it and then treat it at a different time and over time. And these tunnels are massive. Here's a picture on the left of the tunnel as well as on the right. And this is the actual grinder that was used to bore out those tunnels right here below. Now, this is important because not only did we solve the sewer problem, we solved a flooding problem. And so we are also then protecting our drinking water and our infrastructure. So the deep tunnels has completed. They're finishing up one of the reservoirs now, but the tunnels are indeed helping us already. Now I want to talk a little bit about our drinking water supply and maintaining public health. Here's what's happening today. Today we're having problems with what we call chemicals of emerging concern. And these chemicals it's a long list of chemicals, and they can come from pharmaceuticals, from people flushing their medicines into the toilet. And we're trying to educate the water reclamation district, and many of our wastewater treatment plants are trying to educate people about putting personal care products into the water stream. Pesticides and herbicides are still a problem. Disinfectant chemicals and different metals and nanochemicals that are not filtered through our wastewater treatment plants. They were not built originally to this level of filtration to ensure that we filtered out these chemicals. And so these chemicals are in the Great Lakes. We are concerned about them. They include fire retardants and plasticizers that are being used, so modern chemicals. And one of the main chemicals that you may read about that we're concerned about in the lakes right now is PFAs. And PFAs are come from Teflon, as well as food packaging, waterproof jackets, fire retardants. They're stain resistant treatments of carpeting, firefighting foams, and as well as used pretty widely on military, or were used pretty widely on military bases and commercial airports. And so we're seeing these show up in our Great Lakes. I want to quickly turn to air pollution. We do have an air pollution problem here in Chicago. It's ozone. We do have periodic PM10 pollutions from around the quarry areas in the nearby collar suburb communities, but it's ozone that really plagues our city. And you can see here, we did not rank very well. Every year, the American Lung Association and EPA put together data at how we're doing regarding ozone, and we are the 16th most polluted in the nation. Now we have improved during COVID. However, we are transporting back into our offices geospatially. And so it will be really interesting when the 2022 and 2023 numbers eventually come out to see if we've had tremendous improvement. We did see some early improvement, and we'll see if we continue on that path. However, even the Chicago Tribune as of 2020 said Chicago's air is dirtier in July than even LA. And so you can see pictures here of some of the smog that is involved. Now, ozone, we have ozone action alert days for our seniors and asthmatics and people with lung impairments. And primarily ozone is created at the ambient level that we breathe from the nitrogen oxides of cars, the volatile organics, and humidity and sunlight. So the worst time, the reason this chart only shows June and July is because the worst time in Chicago is during these humid months of June and July. And we don't have large prevailing winds that push this smog out of the city. So during these periods in the summer of great humidity and sunshine and car usage, we get a lot of ozone problems. All right, now on to nuclear energy and nuclear waste. And I want to take a closer look about extraction and disposal problems and explain why this is also a Chicago and regional issue. Right now, we are very worried about climate change, and we're in a race to decarbonize, which we need to be because of the concerns about carbon in our atmosphere changing our climate. So one of the energy sources that we are not fossil fuel based, are not carbon based, is nuclear energy. And so the Department of Energy is looking at, in our country, is looking at how we could possibly leverage nuclear energy into a option other than fossil fuels. And so nuclear energy, as you probably know, does not create any carbon. That is absolutely true. And it does not contribute to climate change. And so it has now been reframed as a green energy source, something as an alternative to climate change. The US actually relies very little on nuclear energy overall. Only about 19 to 20% of its total energy is from nuclear. However, that is not true. That is not true for Illinois. We are over 55%. We're now, I believe, at 58%, which I'm going to show you in a minute, dependent on nuclear energy. And in fact, Illinois is the greatest producer of nuclear energy in the US. You can see here, France is one of the countries that was very heavily dependent, and intentionally so, on nuclear energy. They were at the height of their dependency over the years, over 85%. They are now down to 70% and are intentionally trying to get to 50%. There has been some recent debate with Sunday is the French elections. And so the current president, Macron, has actually talked about reinstalling more nuclear energy because they're having problems meeting their carbon emission standards. So France right now is at 70% dependent on nuclear energy, but it is the US that has the most operating reactors, and you can see France has much fewer operating reactors than the US. China is right behind us, and I read this morning, there's a new report out. China is getting ready to build 6 new reactors and is underway with many more. So I think in about 5 years, when we relook at this data, that we might see China right behind, closer to the US in the number of reactors. The US is only, again, 20% dependent on nuclear energy. However, we generate most of the world's nuclear energy. In fact, our share of nuclear energy is actually at about 31% worldwide. Now, what's interesting here is the distribution of where nuclear energy is produced. And you can see Illinois, and that number is from 2019, it's up to 58% under the most recent data that I've pulled. And Illinois is the state that is the most dependent on nuclear energy, and in fact is the greatest producer of nuclear energy in the United States. You can see where nuclear energy is being produced. It is primarily in the mid and east of the US, with some minor outliers here in California, Washington, and Arizona. We have about 96 commercial reactors, and we're a big producer of nuclear energy, but in the world, but in the US, we only contribute about 20% of that mix. Now, Illinois is really interesting because Illinois is the largest producer, right? And as I said, the most current data is that about 58% of our electricity, our energy, comes from nuclear. We have many nuclear power plants, you can see here on the right side on a map, that are not too far from the Chicago area. And we also have the only chemical facility right now that converts uranium into uranium hexafluoride, which is a step in making nuclear fuel. The US Department of Energy is planning and is requesting proposals to build more of these plants because they want to move into more nuclear energy as a solution to climate change. And in fact, in the nation, Illinois generates more electricity from nuclear energy, accounting for 1/8 of the nation's total power generation. So we're a powerhouse in nuclear energy. Now, as we talk about nuclear energy, we have to talk about 2 other really important areas, and that is extraction of the nuclear material and disposal of the nuclear material. The extraction actually originally took place in the Navajo lands. 30 million tons, in fact, of uranium ore was extracted from 1944 to 1989 during our big push to build nuclear weapons in the Cold War, as well as civilian nuclear power plants. This area of the Navajo Nation, you can see, is in the 4 corners of the US. So it spans, their nation spans 4 different states, but you can see that many of the uranium mines depicted here are in 3 of those states: New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. They spanned about 27,000 square miles. The miners were originally Navajo from the Dene culture. They drank the water, they ate lunch in the mines or outside of the mines, and they brought their clothes home. So we had widespread contamination throughout the Navajo Nation that we are still cleaning up. After the uranium was mined, we actually, the company and the US government actually left mill tailings piles that were mined overburdened, and the Navajos then used that for building homes, roads, and other structures on their land. Understand that at this time, during this mining, the Navajos did not have a name for uranium, and they've invented one called Letso, and that is the yellow cake monster. Today, the Navajos, I just came back from visiting and working with the Navajo Nation. They have 523 abandoned mines, which we are cleaning up, and 1,000 other features. Also, the US was the sole consumer of uranium until about 1970, and then sales to commercial industry actually started in 1966. Lots of diseases from this, and in fact, nearly 1/3 of the Navajo members still have high levels of uranium. And as a result, in 1990 and revised in 2020, we created in our Congress, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, where we actually fund and have legislatively apologized to the Navajos for this legacy from nuclear energy. Today, EPA is trying to clean up the mines as well as the structures. We've had a couple 5-year plans from Congress with EPA heading them up in the cleanup. This is Monument Valley here, very rich in uranium. And then we have a 10-year plan that is underway now with EPA and several of the federal agencies in the Navajo Nation. Now I want to turn to the legacy of disposal. When you have nuclear energy, you have to contain its waste. You have to dispose of its waste. There is waste in every energy process. And in 1954, the National Academy of Sciences actually embarked on trying to figure out how to dispose of high-level nuclear waste. This is not low-level. This is not transuranic. This is the waste that comes from the inner core of the nuclear reactor. Reactors overturn every 18 to 24 months and have to be refueled. And so a third or more of their core rods have to be replaced. So this creates a tremendous amount of waste. So we decided in the 1980s and created legislation that we would land disposal. The National Academy of Sciences looked at putting the waste in polar ice caps, shooting it to the sun, shooting it into space. We did for a while put it on the coast in the Atlantic, which is still there, and in the coast on the West Coast. And then in the 1980s, 1990s, we realized that that was not a good idea. And now because of plate tectonics, and now we actually prohibit that. So we have decided on land disposal, and we decided on Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain is about 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas. This is the mountain, and we had cored out this mountain in preparation. You can see this is the DOE site that was operational, and we had cored out the mountain, much like the core of the deep tunnels that I showed you, that grinder, to prepare for storing high-level nuclear waste from our commercial reactors in this mountain. The mountain was considered ideal because you could see the water table is very far below, and this is a remote area. And so this area was in fact selected by legislation signed by Bush and was getting ready to begin operation. Now, if you remember back to the US map that I showed you, Nevada, the state of Nevada actually produces no nuclear energy. And so they were very much opposed to having Yucca Mountain, not in the beginning, but certainly they changed their minds because they realized the amount of shipments that would be going into Yucca Mountain. And as you remember, President Obama, at the time when he was a candidate, actually committed to closing and not having Yucca Mountain as an option. And so when he became president in 2012, we see here on the left side a report where he actually puts together a blue ribbon panel about the disposal of nuclear waste in the US, and he stops Yucca Mountain. So Yucca Mountain never does get open. There are tunnels that were preliminarily drilled. The site has been completely decommissioned. I visited the site a couple months ago, and there's not even a street sign on the site, and it's completely closed. Spent nuclear fuel is what we call the used fuel from a power reactor, and I'm going to show you what that is in a minute. It's one of the most dangerous, long-lasting substances created. The radioisotopes can last for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And so right now, because we don't have land disposal, we are storing in 2 locations around the US, wherever there's a nuclear power plant, in pools of water. 74% is in pools of water, and I'm going to show you a picture of that in a minute. And the other 26% is in dry storage concrete caskets. Right now, we have no permanent disposal for the 70,000 metric tons of spent fuel, and that's growing because our nuclear reactors continuously need to be refueled, and several of them are up for decommissioning. Here's what Yucca Mountain looked like before it got closed. You can see there it was the premier site, the only site for disposing of our commercial nuclear energy waste, which would have been primarily a lot of it from Illinois, because we are the premier state with the highest number of nuclear power plants and the highest amount of high-level nuclear waste from those power plants. Here again is a picture of the grinder. You can see the worker for scale to see how big this grinder was. This grinder was also the technology that was used in the channel between England and France. So I guess I want to really conclude there, and I'm going to show you some more pictures, but I think there's some lessons learned that we have to think about. The legacy of the contamination from waste disposal will continue intergenerationally. Like I said, this waste where we don't have any place to dispose of it right now. And DOE is trying to solicit volunteer sites, but they do not have a means of disposing of this waste. So it is being piled up at various nuclear energy sites, including in Illinois, where it's generated. We are in a race to decarbonize, and DOE is looking for a consent-based siting of a disposal facility for nuclear waste, but does not have one. They've just started that process with President Biden. I would like to call our policy attention that we need more to remediating both the extracted sites that I showed you on the Navajo lands and finding both safe disposal for our nuclear waste, particularly for the state of Illinois. And instead, I'd like to say, maybe what we need to ask is, what is the most sustainable route that we can take in an energy transition? And like the theme I mentioned earlier, are we in the race to use nuclear energy as a carbon-free source, which it is? Are we creating a legacy for the future, for future generations, where we are racing to solve one problem and then creating another one, which we have a pattern of doing as a human society, as well as in the different technologies around Chicago? Now, I promised I wanted to show you some visuals of what it looks like, what I'm talking about. These in the left-hand corner are the dry caskets that are being used on site to store the waste because there is no disposal. This is actually a pool of where the pools are stored for the high-level nuclear waste. I actually, when I was a Department of Energy official, got to look at the 3 Mile Island core while working at the Idaho Engineering Lab, and this is exactly what it looks like. These little squares are the actual bundles that can be moved up and down in the storage. Water prevents gamma radiation, so water is a great protection tool against dangerous radiation. Here's what an inside of a nuclear power plant looks like with that same bundle. You could see this is the bundle here in a diagram with the individual rods being inside of this bundle, and this is the bundle being pulled in and out of a reactor core. This core does have to be refueled and generates waste about 18 to 24 months, and it's about 1/3 to 2/3 depending on the age of the reactor that has to be replaced. Many people, unfortunately, don't know what uranium in terms of fuel looks like. It gets processed into these small pellets. It's the size of an eraser. These pellets get stacked up into a fuel rod and then put in an assembly and then put inside of the reactor. All right, so that's all I have. I would like to take questions at this point. I do want to say one thing. I think for Chicago's future, we have to think about continuing to build resilience for what's coming regarding climate change. And that includes flooding, extreme temperatures, storms. And I think we're doing somewhat of a good job at that. COVID has taught us the usefulness of technology in lieu of transportation regarding air pollution. And I think we need to continue, of course, to protect our water, air, and land. And I think we have to start dealing with nuclear waste and tying nuclear waste and extraction to the use of nuclear energy. Of course, modernizing our grid would help, energy efficiency technologies would help, and storage. And the NREL, which is the Renewable Energy Lab, the National Renewable Energy Lab by the DOE outside of Denver, is actually working on these things regarding the grid and storage. So I'm open for any questions you have. I'm really hoping that this presentation was informative as well as visuals so that you can conceptualize what these things look like. Thank you.
Wow, Professor Tzoumis, thank you so much. That was a lot of great information. I was born and raised here in Chicago in a youth really just taught me a lot. Behind the scenes, things that I did not know and have the knowledge of. We had a few questions come through, and also if you have any more questions, please send them through the chat or Q&A feature below. And I'm going to ask a few questions that came up. Someone wanted to know, when did the river reversal occur?
In 1900. In fact, I've seen they did it at midnight, and I've actually seen in the Water Reclamation District the lithographs of when they actually started the reversal. And it was so I can't believe that the digging, because the digging took place for years, but it somehow St. Louis wasn't able to stop it. And so at midnight, I've seen the cutting of the ribbons and the opening up of the canal that reversed. So it was January, right at the turn of the year in 1900.
Wow. Do you think we will be able to do something like that today and get away with it?
Probably not today, because our telecommunications is quite good. In fact, I suspect we'd have passerbys videoing it, right? Mm-hmm. And so probably because of our lack of telecommunications and speed, no, I don't think that could happen today.
Okay. The other comment said, CO2 does not contribute to warming, rather it greens our Earth. The sun, water, and planetary motion drive our climate, not CO2. Even though it is a greenhouse gas, we need all forms of energy, including nuclear, not just a select few. So did you have any comment for that?
Yeah, I do agree with the second part of that. Nuclear has to be part of the energy mix. I just want us to be aware as a region that we are generating a lot of most high-level nuclear waste in the US, and we don't have a place to dispose of it. And so I want us to be aware of that. And, we may, for decades, it may take even longer to get to a community that will agree to have this high-level nuclear waste repository, which got canceled. So nuclear is definitely a source. However, it is a trade. We're trading carbon for nuclear waste. And so I think we just need to be aware of that as a state and be making decisions that are transparent.
Okay. Someone else said that another Chicago tied to this, the first nuclear reactor built was done at the University of Chicago, right on the south side. The remnants are buried in the Paleo-spores preserve.
Correct. And I was the project manager on that. It was tritium, actually. Enrico Fermi actually did a number of tests, for civilian, and he was a professor at University of Chicago in Stagg Field. It was a squash court. It's called CP1. And he built his laboratory where he did a lot of injections of radioisotopes into animals and disposed of them in the Red Gate Woods. And unfortunately, this was a time period where we didn't understand the issues with radioisotopes migrating into water supplies and soils. And so Red Gate Woods did have some contamination. You can go there now and see the information boards of the history of Enrico Fermi's lab. And the Department of Energy has been cleaning that up, and for many years working with Willowbrook and the surrounding community members. I actually worked on that project and brought in the League of Women Voters to develop a group to work with the community on the remediation of that site. But the person is absolutely right. That came from Enrico Fermi. He was a professor at University of Chicago, and Enrico Fermi was part of that Atoms for Peace under Eisenhower, where we developed civilian nuclear energy. And so he had his lab out in Red Gate Woods in the southern suburbs.
Okay, and someone wanted to know, are we running out of uranium?
That's a really good question. We are not running out of uranium. There's very few sites in the world, and the Four Corners is one of them, where we can access uranium. Canada is one, the Congo is one, and we were worried about actually Hitler getting his uranium from there during World War II, but and also Australia. So we do have sites. Ours is very accessible. It's on the Navajo lands. The Navajos have legislated a ban, so we can no longer go back to those mines to get uranium, but there is enough uranium available. We also mine it out of Wyoming. And so there's enough uranium on the market the problem is we need more processing facilities if we're going to continue using nuclear fuel. So the Department of Energy has an active request to find sites for the reprocessing facilities, or I should say processing facilities for uranium. We are one of the few countries, this is an interesting policy point, since Jimmy Carter outlawed by proclamation, we do not reprocess our fuel. France, Europe, all of the other countries that are nuclear countries actually reprocess their fuel. It is against the law for us to do that. So we would have to buy new uranium and process it through facilities to make it enriched fuel, but we do not reprocess. So that's why the disposal issue is a big one, because we do not take the high level spent fuel and recycle it. It's against the law here in the US. Carter was thinking there was a national security issue. And so we've never reversed that. That is our policy today.
Okay, and someone wanted to know, have you read the book Girls of the Atomic City? And if so, would you recommend it to others?
Yes, and I teach it in my class. In fact, Chicago years ago had a play based on that book. There's very few of the ladies left, the Radium Girls, as well as other people associated with the Atomic City. I would recommend that book. I think it's very interesting, and the history is fascinating.
Okay, and someone said, when relations were better with Russia, the US converted nuclear weapons material into nuclear fuel. There are still nuclear weapons out there that can be converted to nuclear fuel if we can manage it.
That is correct. We do have a variety of plutonium that could be recycled. It is against the law to do that, like I said, because Jimmy Carter's proclamation. We do not recycle high-level fuel in the US. The rest of the countries around the world do. And so, yes, we are second to Russia. Russia has over 7,000 nuclear warheads in their stockpiles. We are not too far behind them. I think it's about 4,000, the last 4,000 or 5,000 last time I checked. So there's plenty of uranium. I don't know that we need to mine it. I don't think extraction, we have to finish up cleaning up those mines, but we do have to take that uranium and reprocess it. And we're not doing that in the US.
I know that you said like during the pandemic, things are getting better. Do you think that regular cars will be a thing of the past and like everyone will be forced to get electric cars, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, okay, I'm an owner of a couple times now, hybrids and electric cars, and they're expensive. There was tax rebates for them, but for the average citizen, they're out of the reach for many of us. And so we are switching, I think, our public transit to, much of it has been switched to natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel, but we are moving into hybrids. And you can see President Biden is putting up charging stations everywhere. And so we're starting to get more flexibility in using these cars. And I want to say that these cars are coming down in price. I spend very little on gasoline. In fact, I can go for months and months, never going to a pump. And we're seeing also hybrids moving into our SUVs, which is great, the bigger vehicles. So I do think we are benefiting from moving into non-fossil fuel cars. Biden is pushing for more of that. And I think that has helped Chicago. The pandemic helped Chicago air quality, in that we were not all either in mass transit or driving down into a central location. And so we saw some improvement in air quality during the height of the pandemic.
I think that is all of our questions. Again, thank you so much, Professor Tzoumis, and thank you to all of our alumni who showed up today. I hope to see everybody at another event soon. I hope everyone enjoys Earth Day and have a great weekend. Again, thank you so much, Professor. Everybody have a great evening.
Happy Earth Day. And if there's any more questions as follow-up, feel free to email me at k.tzoumis@depaul.edu.
Yes, and we had a few. things in the chat you can look over before we close out. People will thank you and tell them a little bit about their background. Well, thank you all so much again, and have a great rest of your day.
Happy Earth Day, everyone.